Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Marin Economic Briefing. My name is Mike Blakely, and I am the CEO of the Marin Economic Forum. For those that don't know, we are a 501c3 nonprofit based here in Marin County, and we provide research and advisory on the Bay Area and Marin County economy. You can find out more about what we do by visiting our website at marineconomicforum.org. And if you haven't already subscribed to our communications so that you can get invited to events like this and receive our email newsletters, you can subscribe at the website. Please do. Welcome to the November economic briefing. Since the time we last met together in October, we've added a second global conflict. The headlines this morning in the business news is about WeWork, the co-working space, the national co-working space filing for bankruptcy. And although that was previewed, it still is a jolt to the global national co-working and remote work question that we keep looking at, and the return to office question. And then today is November 7th. Many states across the U.S. are voting. We are just 1 year away from our own presidential election. And what all of this presents is uncertainty. And what economies don't like and economists don't like is uncertainty, because it makes the job of predicting and advising very difficult. Fortunately for us, we're joined today by MEF Chief Economist, Dr. Rob Eiler, who's going to take us through the data at the national, state, and local level. He'll help us try to make sense of what's happening out there and going forward. And then when Rob is finished, I'll come back and I'll talk about two new initiatives at MEF that I think everybody's going to be excited for. So thank you again for joining us. If you do have questions, please feel free to drop those in the chat. And as always, a video recording of this and the slide deck will be sent to you by email if you are registered. So thanks again for joining. And let me bring in Rob Eiler. Good morning, Rob.
Morning, Mike. Thanks so much, folks, for coming today. Appreciate that. And Mike, thanks for teeing up where we're at in a sort of a general level. So I normally start this discussion with a look at the labor market and its continued evolution. So one of the big questions is whether or not we're in the beginnings of a recession or we're currently in one. And the labor market's not suggesting that, but I like to always compare it to the Great Recession, just to remind us how quickly we emerged as a national economy from the pandemic from a labor market standpoint, and why we have continue to expand, or at least we can see the seeds of expansion. That blue line is the Great Recession in terms of the total number of people working in the United States starting in November 2007 and calling that number 100. It took 78 months to get back to that red dotted line. So we did not have any job growth at all over that 78-month period in net. The black line you can see is set at January 2020. And we recovered about 32 months later, and we have been expanding our labor market since that time. And we're now 3.2% above the January 2020 pre-pandemic benchmark after seasonal adjustments in terms of the aggregate labor market in the United States. So we will not see a declared recession until that number starts to go down, and go down somewhat in earnest, not just immediately turn down, but it's got to continue to go down in trend. And we will not have really any change in the way the Federal Reserve is looking at interest rates, because we expect there's going to be still some of this underlying pressure in pricing until the labor markets sag a little bit more. So the last month's data suggested we're starting to see a slower growth of labor, but not necessarily job loss. So that continued drumbeat of higher jobs growth is going to continue to pressure inflation on the demand side of the economy, at least in theory. Now, if you look at inflation, however, it has been zooming down a little bit. So these are the price data that the Federal Reserve looks at when it makes interest rate decisions on a monthly basis, seasonally adjusted since January 2007. That September 3.7% number suggests that we have seen a downturn from the peak. You can see that blue solid line peaked somewhere in early 2022, had sort of some fits and starts toward the early part of this year, and now has been declining more rapidly. One of the ways to view that sort of up and down at the peak of this graph is the so-called lag of monetary policy, that once interest rates started to increase March 2022, it took about 9 or 12 months for those higher rates to start having some fruition in terms of changing the way consumers were spending money, and changing the way that businesses were thinking about investment and expansion, and then ultimately starting to have that effect on demand, as well as having supply side relief all kind of coming together. So what the Federal Reserve wants to see happen is they want this blue line to move through those red dots and keep on going toward that blue dotted line toward the next couple of years. But notice that we're just barely getting back to that blue dotted line, which represents where the Federal Reserve wants inflation to be kind of on a long-term basis. They want that blue solid line to revolve around the dotted line in such a way that two things happen is one, inflation becomes more predictable, and two, the work that they're doing is more credible in terms of taming inflation as a focal aspect of monetary policy. Now, these data are called core personal consumption expenditures prices, with the idea that everything we buy at home has a certain price, and the change in that, the price of that entire basket 12 months later is that percentage change. So September 3.7% is thinking in September 2023, it cost 3.7% more to buy that basket of goods than it did September 2022. Core means that we pulled food and energy prices out of that basket because they tend to be more volatile, but we're seeing that core move down. And at the end of the day, there's a lot of debate about whether or not food and energy prices should or should not be pulled out of that basket, especially given what's flared up in the Middle East and what might provide some unfortunate continued pressure on prices to remain somewhat elevated as global supply chains react to what may or may not happen in terms of a broadening of that conflict. We're going to watch very closely how the Federal Reserve watch these data and then start to continue to make reactions based on those. For right now, they're holding interest rates because that line continues to move down through those red dots. So will that continued fall move all the way through 2026? We're watching that closely because how the Federal Reserve now maybe starts thinking about lowering interest rates and what you can think of as sort of guiding a soft landing of not too many job losses, not really taking the gas off the pedal in terms of moving those prices down. Will we get there? And then two, does it mean we're going to have at least one more rate increase because it's still somewhat elevated? And this is kind of the big question on Wall Street, is whether or not the Federal Reserve feels like it has actually done its job. We will see. But we should not expect the Fed to start moving rates down until we see the jobs in the last slide start to move down in earnest, and we start to see more of a complete movement down toward that blue dotted line. That juxtaposition of the jobs and the inflation data are now the kind of the viewpoint of the Federal Reserve and of most of the financial side of our economy, and trying to guess what the Federal Reserve is going to do next. I usually show a forecast from the Philadelphia Federal Reserve in these talks, but because that's now a few months old, I wanted to show you the latest sort of bellwether forecast, which is from the IMF. They updated their forecast for the global economy a couple of weeks ago. For the US, they actually have upgraded this year and a little bit next year, with the idea that the resiliency in the labor market in the United States is actually helping give a little bit more sanguinity, if you want to put it that way, to forecasts in the American economy. And we're going to see this when the Federal Reserve publishes their forecast of that so-called survey of professional forecasters in a couple of weeks. We should see the forecast pick up a little bit. But that 1.5% for the US next year suggests that we are going to slow down. So the pain is going to start showing up. And we're creeping closer to what might feel like a little bit more of a recessionary economy. I wanted to point out two other global economies that may have some effect on the national economy here in the United States, and those are China and India. So India has really started to accelerate in terms of kind of taking over in the post-pandemic world, where China is really struggling between its real estate, its middle class trying to figure out what it wants to do next, where the jobs are going to be, the ability of the Chinese economy to export. India is becoming the engine in some ways of the Asian economy, at least for the short term. And the forecasts for the Indian economy are still relatively strong, even though it's slowed down a little bit for this year and next. The Chinese economy is kind of stumbling forward. And even if you look at those numbers for China and say, wow, I'll take 5% growth any day, they really need, because of their population size, growth to be a little higher than that on a regular basis. And so we're watching China very closely to see how not only its interactions geopolitically, but how its economy continues to move forward, or becomes a little bit more maybe of a mix of the US and European economies in terms of finding its way with a broadening middle class. One of the unique pictures that have emerged from California about its labor market is this one. And so the blue line is the labor force in California in terms of the people that we count as either working or actively seeking work. The orange line is the subgroup of that labor force that is actually working. And so the distance between the blue and the orange line is in fact the unemployed. So as those two lines get closer and closer, the unemployment rate shrinks. And you can see when the pandemic shock hit, these data are monthly on a seasonally adjusted basis from January 2010 to September 2023, which are the latest data, you can see the shock of the pandemic where that space gets very big, and it's been narrowing ever since, even though it's gotten a little bigger over the last 6 or 8 months. And the black line is the total number of people who are employed at jobs that are located with employers in California. So historically, there has been a gap between the number of workers working in California and the number of people employed in a job in California, which suggests that Californians have historically worked both in California and other places, but lived in California. So the blue and the orange line are people that live in California. The black, they could live anywhere. Notice, since the pandemic, that gap has narrowed and in fact is basically non-existent, which means we've kind of flipped it now to where people are working for California employees, but living some other place. So this graph really kind of tells a story of that out-migration of workers and how the nature of living and working in California has shifted, at least in the initial stages of the post-pandemic world. If we look at Marin County, I should say one more thing. We haven't really had no jobs growth at all in California over the last 12 months. So one of the things about the Federal Reserve's policy in trying to curb jobs growth and reduce demand and thus reduce inflation pressure is that California is sort of leading the exact thing the Federal Reserve is trying to do. Basically, not a quick reduction in jobs, but more or less flat jobs, which should contract consumption, contract inflation pressure. California is doing that. The rest of the United States is still kind of growing enough to where it's keeping recession at bay. But California has sagged a little bit in that we have seen 307,000 more people working for California employers, but residents are now down 500 people to just basically flat in terms of those that live in California that are working in the aggregate. So just kind of some intriguing changes in our labor market in California. We look at Marin County through the same lens, we're going to see that since January 2010, also on a seasonally adjusted basis, we grew from about 131,000 people that live and work in Marin County for some employer somewhere to just a little bit over 140 before the pandemic hit, then the shock, and we're basically back where we were right around the same time in 2010. This is the number of people employed. So that gap, the unemployment rate closes up, the shock has closed up again, but we have not seen a comeback to the pre-pandemic level. So population change in Marin County has sort of traded local workers for local residents that may or may not be working. And that's something we're going to watch going forward, is whether or not we see that those numbers start to creep back up toward those pre-pandemic levels, or if we're seeing a shift in the available labor force that comes from Marin County residents. This is the number of people who have a job in Marin County. So we've seen a pretty good comeback actually in Marin County over the last 7 or 8 months. A lot of that driven by personal services, leisure and hospitality specifically. And we're creeping back up on the number of people working in Marin County for an employer here, almost back to the pre-pandemic level. So another intriguing aspect, which is somewhat of a Bay Area phenomenon, or Bay Area wide phenomenon, is we're seeing that the people that live and work in these areas is not going back to the pre-pandemic level very quickly, but those that work for a local employer have crept up, which means that there are job engines here, but we're probably hiring from the outside somewhere. And in many cases, probably from some other states. One reason, or at least one place at which some of the blame for outmigration in our region has been placed, is in the housing prices. So we're going to look at 2 different angles on what's going on with housing. One is sort of a classic viewpoint on the supply side of new housing, which is building permits. And I'm going to show you the evolution since 1990. This is the evolution of California building permits using basically the bottom of the Great Recession, because the Great Recession was so much focused on construction and housing, as the benchmark equal to 100 in this index. And you can see how many homes we were building in California, or what the pace of change was until the slide down starting in 2006. And that the pace was much slower, though we grew the number of housing units from 2009 forward. That has flattened out now a little bit during the pandemic and post-pandemic period. And you can see that on the far right. Now, if you look at Marin County, just like every other sort of smaller county in California around the United States, is a little more episodic in terms of growth, where you have a big project come in, and this includes both single family and multifamily homes. So the whole point of these graphs are really to show, hey, what is happening with the amount of construction activity for new units, and how does that potentially affect the supply side of the housing equation looking forward, because there's an enormous amount of political rhetoric in California that we want to build more homes and that we need to build more homes to kind of rebalance the supply and demand conditions in housing. What these data suggest is that we do not have an enormous amount of activity suggesting that we're on that path. And Marin County really bottomed out somewhere in the early 2010s rather than in 2009 like the state did. We had some pretty decent coming out in the early part of the 2010s, and then the new housing permits sort of, meandered around toward the beginning of the pandemic and have taken off a little bit since then. But a relatively large project will put a pretty big pop in these numbers. The point is that on the supply side of the housing equation, we have not seen an enormous amount of construction, but we have had a lot of conditions for demand. Now, why that's relevant, if we start to look at the forecast looking forward 1 year from the latest data, which come from September, toward the third quarter of next year, we have kind of a mixed bag of looks around the state in terms of what the forecast for housing prices look like. So in places like Riverside, San Bernardino, San Diego is kind of an outlier here in terms of the other places, as is Santa Barbara. But most of the positive energy in terms of seeing a better forecast in California for housing next year is in the Central Valley and towards the Inland Empire, rather than along the coast and in the northern portion of California. We can see most of those counties on the far right-hand side are in the Bay Area or moving up toward the Oregon border. All the other counties of California and their forecast lie between Kings County and Marin County on this graph. So it suggests that even with the mixed bag, notice that the percentage changes from 2.7 to 4.3% for 1 year looking forward, given relatively high interest rates, some thought that labor markets are going to start to shed jobs, still relatively lingering high inflation. Housing markets still have some decent momentum in terms of price supports. And a lot of that is because the demand side of moving from rental to home ownership still remains in place, even with relatively high interest rates. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. Then thinking about where, if you're going to lose your job in the supply side, we have not seen an increase on the existing or new side of the market that is providing a bunch of price relief yet. So that's the game we're looking for, is that we're going to get a forecast for 10 or 15% downturn in prices. And the answer is, well, the last year around California, we talked about the 6 or 8 months ago, the prediction was somewhere between 10 and 15%, but pretty much got realized right around 10% across the board in California. We may have turned a corner here with the idea that housing markets, because the supply side is not changing that much, are still providing some price support. One place to watch closely is in commercial real estate. So there's going to be a little bit more heat in commercial real estate, specifically in office space. And Mike suggested right off the top about WeWork. That's may or may not be so-called canary in a coal mine as a way of thinking about this problem. But what I wanted to show you is a graph I saw in a study that I really just jumped out at me. There's a bunch of firms that are doing this, but one firm specifically, Castle Systems, is tracking key swipe data from major office buildings in metro areas around the United States since the pandemic. So these data are set at 100% as of February 2020. So if you say, okay, this was the utilization of commercial real estate, specifically office space in metro areas, February 2020. What's happened since then? And you can see this precipitous drop in the utilization. In other words, the number of people walking in with a key swipe to go to work, and how it has climbed back up as people have come back to the office. And there's a little bit of seasonality. This is not seasonally adjusted, but basically in a trend situation, the middle of the distribution is about 49.1%, or just under half utilization that we had February 2020. At the max, it's about 60.2, and at the min, it's about 38.6. So have people come back to work? Yes. Is this suggesting that there may be some problems with having relatively full utilization, or at least pre-pandemic reachievement of utilization of office space? Yes. And what that means is not only should we see some really tricky situations, specifically in the core Bay Area and our metro areas, like say San Francisco, San Jose, Oakland, where we are going to have some pretty inexpensive, large buildings maybe transacting over the next few years. But what's that mean for secondary and tertiary commercial real estate and business markets that service those inbound commuters that may not be coming back? So our big cities, specifically San Francisco, are going to be transforming in ways that may actually be net positive for the long term, but are going to transform in a way that we may not be utilizing those areas as places to commute, but more as places to live and places to visit. than we have in the past, and maybe some rebalancing is coming there. So watch for that as a big headwind in terms of real estate markets and what that may or may not mean in terms of credit availability. The more and more some banks and credit unions and savings banks have exposure to commercial real estate changes. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Mike to talk about the partner program that's being developed by MEF. Thank you.
Rob, thanks so much. Before we get into my remarks, just a couple of quick follow-up questions. One of the things that I hear a lot here is that the economy from a data perspective is faring quite well, but the general mood of people is pretty negative about the economy. And there's a lot of reasons why, including the fact that people aren't looking at the same data that economists like yourself are. When you look at those core prices, you said that you removed gas and food because they're volatile. But what else could make a difference there in terms of prices coming down? What good or service needs to come down for people to feel that, the economy is doing okay and they're doing okay with their ability to consume?
Yeah, so great question, Mike. So the trickiness of that is that you'd say, okay, well, maybe the best thing, because one of the things I buy a lot of is services. So it's more expensive to have somebody come out and work on my home. It's more expensive to go to get a haircut. So a lot of things have gone up in price because general inflation is now transmitting itself through higher wages and higher cost of goods in such a way that our merchants want to hand some of that price increase off to us. The reality of it is it's in housing. So while on the surface, you might think, God, it'd be great to see services prices kind of come back a little bit, or at least flatten out a little bit to where they're not continuously growing. It's housing prices that are the biggest chunk of what we buy in that basket of goods at home. So if we don't see much price relief on the housing side, we might have kind of sustained inflation that, in other words, instead of going back down to 2% a year, it might be more like 2.5% for a while, simply because we're not getting that cut in prices. And if there's one market that will actually go up and then come back down in price hard, it's in housing. If you think about going and having accounting services done, a lawyer, even a haircut, when those prices go up, it isn't like, well, we're going to move a haircut up to $35, and once inflation's gone away, we're going to move it back down to 25. Once it's 35, you're pretty much done, and it's not coming back. So it's in housing where most of the dynamic relief is going to come or not come in those data. But again, there's, like you said earlier, it kind of depends on what data you're looking at. If you're a homeowner, not coming back down is actually great. If you're a renter and you're waiting to jump into the home ownership market, that's where you're going to be more pessimistic about what that inflation is really telling you.
Yeah, well, that's well explained. And I think this has been an issue that has been long an issue in Marin County housing prices, but we'll see what the future holds. So thanks for that, Rob. And as Rob mentioned, and I said at the outset, there's a couple of new initiatives here at the Marin Economic Forum that are really designed to help engage the community a little more. For the 10 plus years that MEF has been around, if you wanted to engage or be a part of our day-to-day activities, you had to be really a member of our board. We didn't have a good mechanism to allow other organizations and individuals to participate with us and influence the work that we do. So recently, our board of directors took the decision to approve what's called a new partner program for MEF. And the idea here is that, unlike a chamber or other member-based organization where members join and have a vote and all that, we've developed a new partner program, which is allowing organizations to join with MEF and appoint one or more designees to be involved in some of our more day-to-day activities. So there are two things that we're going to be focusing on next year that we're hoping to have community engagement in. The first issue is workforce development. And if you've tuned into these briefings before, you've heard me talk with great concern about our labor market and what we're doing in terms of job creation. So that is going to be one of our priority issues. And our whole idea here is that we can encourage more ecosystem actors. So whether it's public sector, education sector, employers, we want all those folks to be part of our organization and help us decide on the activities where we can have a real impact in workforce development. The second area is in business attraction. So as some of you may know, a very typical economic development approach for regions like Marin County is to do some proactive business attraction. As Rob just talked about, and I mentioned with WeWork, there's great changes underfoot with how businesses are staffing their offices and where they're staffing. And Marin County has had, even pre-pandemic, a lot of excellent advantages for a certain type of company here. We've got a highly skilled workforce that lives right here. We've got relatively less expensive and I would say nicer Class A office properties here. And we've got an excellent location as it relates to drawing workers from the Northeast or the South to come here. So in the absence of business attraction efforts being done by cities themselves or even the county, MEF is going to start filling that space and working collaboratively with partners around the county to start seeing how we can bring more businesses here, encourage those businesses that want to start here or those businesses that are already established and might want to locate here. We think that there's a great opportunity to do that. If you look at the data and competitiveness factors of Marin County versus other regions in the Bay Area, we score very favorably. So those are two issues that we're going to focus on. And the way that we're going to engage the community in that is through this new partnership program. So in our email follow-up to all of you with the recording and this slide deck, we will be including a brochure that talks a little bit more about that program, how you can be a part of it. And we think this is going to be a great thing to get more community engagement in MEF's day-to-day. There's definitely going to be a benefit for those that join in terms of networking and getting a chance to engage with community leaders. So we're very excited about it. We hope you are too. Look for that in the email that follows up. And with that, I'm going to wrap this up and thank everybody for joining us. We will be here again in December, hopefully with a little more certainty on what's happening. But Rob, thank you so much for that, and stay involved. Thanks, everybody.